The first thing that changed wasn't my body, it was the moment I realized I had already crossed a line I couldn't uncross. I remember standing alone in the lab long after everyone else had gone home, the hum of the ventilation system filling the silence like a held breath. The serum vial sat upright in its foam cradle, clear and unassuming, as if it had no opinion about what it was capable of doing. I had designed it to be neutral, adaptive, responsive, almost conversational at the molecular level. It wasn't meant to force change. It was meant to reveal it. That was the lie I told myself, anyway. I had spent years studying transitional biology, how systems adapt under pressure, how identity persists or dissolves when the rules shift. My published work framed it in safe language: hormonal modulation, psychosomatic feedback loops, neuroplastic recalibration. What I didn't put in the papers was the quiet obsession underneath it all. The private question I never asked out loud: what happens when the observer becomes the subject? I told myself this was about responsibility. If something went wrong, it should be me who bore the cost, not a volunteer who trusted my credentials and my smile. That argument held up well enough in ethics reviews, but it rang hollow now, alone with the vial. Responsibility was part of it, but so was curiosity, and something softer, harder to name. A sense that I had been living adjacent to myself for a long time, studying from behind glass. The serum wasn't magic. It couldn't rewrite chromosomes or rearrange the past. What it did, what I hoped it would do, was amplify latent identity signals the brain already carried, allowing the body to follow with minimal resistance. In theory, it was reversible. In theory, everything important was. I logged my baseline vitals, hands steady from habit if not from certainty. I noted my reflection in the darkened monitor. Tired eyes, familiar angles, a face I had worn without much thought for decades. There was nothing wrong with it. That was the strangest part. No pain, no crisis, no dramatic dissatisfaction. Just a persistent sense of neutrality, as if my life had been written in a competent but uninspired hand. When I injected the serum, there was no cinematic moment, no rush, no heat, no immediate signal that I had done something irreversible. I cleaned the site, disposed of the materials, and sat down to wait, feeling faintly ridiculous. This was what all the secrecy had been building toward? A quiet lab stool and the tick of a wall clock? The first real shift came as an emotional recalibration, subtle enough that I almost missed it. Thoughts I normally kept at arm's length, about presentation, about how I was perceived, about the quiet envy I felt watching certain women move through the world with a kind of social permission I'd never questioned, rose without triggering the usual internal defenses. There was no panic. No shame spike. Just space. That scared me more than pain would have. I realized how much effort I had spent not thinking certain thoughts, not following certain lines of curiosity. The serum didn't insert anything new, it removed friction. It was like discovering that a door I'd assumed was locked had never been latched at all. Physically, the changes were incremental and unremarkable at first. A shift in balance. A different awareness of my posture. Sensations that didn't announce themselves so much as ask to be noticed. I documented everything, but the data felt secondary now, like subtitles to a conversation happening somewhere deeper. The real tension wasn't in my body, it was in my relationships, still waiting for me outside the lab. My sister, who trusted me to be steady and predictable. Colleagues who knew me as rigorous, cautious, almost conservative in my methods. Friends who thought they knew my limits because I had carefully shown them only those. I hadn't told anyone. That was another line crossed. Not because secrecy is inherently wrong in science, sometimes it's necessary, but because this secrecy wasn't about protecting others. It was about buying myself time to understand what honesty would require of me. As the hours passed, I felt an unfamiliar alignment settle in, not joy exactly, but coherence. Like static clearing from a signal I hadn't known was distorted. I also felt grief, sharp and unexpected, for the years I had spent assuming this coherence wasn't available to me, or wasn't worth the cost. By the time I locked up the lab and stepped out into the cool night air, I understood something that would shape everything that followed. Whatever this experiment became, it was no longer just mine. Every choice I made from here on would ripple outward, into trust, into credibility, into the lives of people who hadn't agreed to be part of my self-discovery. And yet, walking to my car, I stood a little differently. Not performatively. Not self-consciously. Just, honestly. That was the moment I knew the most difficult transformation wouldn't be explaining the science. It would be explaining myself. I didn't tell anyone for 3 days, which might not sound like much until you consider how rarely I went 3 days without explaining myself to someone. The serum continued working in ways that resisted clean measurement. My logs grew increasingly inadequate, full of qualifiers and margins notes, as if I were apologizing to the data for my own subjectivity. Sleep changed first. Not in duration, but in texture. I dreamed with an emotional specificity that startled me awake more than once, conversations replayed with different inflections, memories reframed through reactions I hadn't allowed myself to feel the first time around. I wasn't dreaming of becoming someone else. I was dreaming of having always been more porous than I'd admitted. In the mornings, I stood longer in front of the mirror, not out of vanity, but out of unfamiliar curiosity. I was trained to observe systems for deviation, so of course I noticed the subtle shifts, softened tension in my jaw, the way my expression seemed to arrive a half second before my thoughts rather than lag behind them. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would register to a stranger. But to me, it felt like discovering a dialect I had spoken poorly my entire life and was only now beginning to pronounce correctly. What unsettled me most was not the change itself, but how quickly my internal resistance dissolved. I had always assumed that if I ever questioned my gender expression seriously, it would arrive as crisis if panic, conflict, something that demanded urgency. Instead, it arrived like clarity. And clarity, I learned, can be terrifying when your identity has been built around being certain of other things. I went to work as usual. Same clothes, same ID badge, same coffee order from the cafe downstairs where the barista greeted me by name without really seeing me. I wondered how much of my life had been conducted that way, recognized but not perceived, including by myself. The lab felt different now, not because it had changed, but because I had. Equipment I had designed felt less like tools and more like extensions of intention. I caught myself wondering, for the first time, how much of science was shaped not by neutrality but by the unexamined identities of the people conducting it. Who we assumed the default human to be. Whose bodies were treated as deviations rather than data. During a departmental meeting, a colleague made an offhand joke about a grant proposal involving gender-affirming care, nothing overtly cruel, just dismissive, framed as efficiency. I would have let it pass before. That day, my silence felt heavy, complicit. I didn't challenge him directly. I asked a question instead, about patient-reported outcomes, about long-term psychological markers. My voice didn't shake, but my hands did under the table. The room shifted slightly. Not dramatically. But I felt the cost of speaking in a way I hadn't before, and I realized that cost had always existed. I had just never been the one paying it. That afternoon, my sister called. We spoke every week, reliably, comfortably. She told me about her kids, about work frustrations, about the quiet heroism of keeping a household running. I listened, offered the expected affirmations. Then she paused and asked, casually, "Are you okay? You sound different." The word landed harder than any physical symptom had. I told her I was tired. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. After we hung up, I sat alone in my office and felt the first real wave of guilt. Not for changing, but for withholding. For rehearsing versions of myself for different audiences, a habit I had perfected long before the serum ever existed. That night, I opened the secure folder where I kept my unpublished notes, the ones no ethics board would ever see. I wrote not as a scientist but as a witness. About the sense of alignment. About the grief. About the fear of being understood incorrectly. I acknowledged, on the page, something I hadn't yet said even to myself. This wasn't just an experiment. It was an admission. The physical transformation progressed slowly, respectfully, as if my body were negotiating each step rather than surrendering to it. I appreciated that. It mirrored my emotional state, curious but cautious, open but not reckless. I experimented privately with presentation, not as performance, but as inquiry. How did certain fabrics change my posture? How did my reflection affect my mood? These weren't aesthetic questions, they were psychological ones. Each answer revealed how deeply social cues had been embedded in my sense of self. What surprised me most was how little of this felt like becoming something new, and how much felt like allowing something old to surface. That realization complicated my understanding of authenticity. If I had been functional, successful, even content before, what did it mean to say I was now more myself? Was that a judgment on my past, or simply an expansion of it? I thought often about responsibility. As a scientist, as a sibling, as a person with social capital, I hadn't earned so much as inherited. I worried about the narrative others would impose: midlife crisis, professional recklessness, attention-seeking. I worried, too, about the opposite, that my experience would be treated as exceptional, insulated by privilege, disconnected from the realities faced by those without my safety nets. That tension became a kind of compass. It pushed me toward honesty, but not spectacle. Toward conversation, but not confession for its own sake. I began planning disclosures the way I planned experiments: who needed to know, when, and why. Not to control outcomes, that was impossible, but to act with integrity. The serum had done what it was designed to do. It had reduced resistance. What it hadn't done, and couldn't do, was make the choices for me. Late one evening, as I prepared another set of notes, I caught my reflection again, this time in the glass of the lab door. I saw uncertainty there, yes, but also resolve. Not the brittle kind that demands certainty, but the flexible kind that allows growth. I understood then that the transformation was no longer private. The question was no longer what is happening to me. It was, who do I become accountable to now? The first person I told was not the one I expected. I had rehearsed the conversation with my sister a dozen times in my head, mapped the emotional terrain, anticipated questions, prepared clarifications that balanced honesty with reassurance. I believed she deserved to hear it early, but I also knew that once I crossed that threshold, there would be no version of my life untouched by the disclosure. Family doesn't compartmentalize well. Family absorbs. Instead, the truth surfaced with Miriam. Miriam worked 2 floors below me, in an adjacent research unit that focused on clinical translation rather than theoretical modeling. We had known each other for years in the polite, professional sense, shared elevators, overlapping grant committees, the occasional long conversation at conferences that never quite crossed into friendship. She was perceptive in a way that made some people uncomfortable, the kind of person who listened for what wasn't being said. We ran into each other in the stairwell late one evening, both of us avoiding the elevator out of fatigue rather than principle. She glanced at me, then did a double take, not exaggerated, not rude, just attentive. "Can I ask you something?" she said. I nodded, already bracing. "You seem more present lately," she said carefully. "Not happier, exactly. Just clearer." I laughed before I could stop myself. It came out brittle. We sat on the stairs, the institutional lighting flattening everything into shades of beige. I don't remember deciding to tell her. I remember realizing that if I didn't, I would be lying in a way that felt heavier than silence. So I told her part of it. About the research becoming personal. About testing a hypothesis on myself. About questioning things I'd previously treated as settled. I didn't use the word gender at first. I talked around it, as I'd done for years, skilled at orbiting truths without landing on them. She listened without interrupting. When I finally stopped, she didn't rush to interpret or reassure. "That sounds lonely," she said. "Not dangerous. Not irresponsible. Not confusing. Lonely." Something in my chest loosened painfully, like a muscle unclenching after years of tension. I hadn't realized how much of my fear was about being misdiagnosed emotionally, having my experience reduced to pathology or impulse rather than recognized as process. She asked questions, but they were gentle ones. How long I'd been thinking about this. Whether I felt supported. What I was afraid of losing. When she asked what I hoped to gain, I surprised myself by answering honestly. "Alignment," I said. I want my internal life to stop arguing with my external one. She nodded, as if that made perfect sense. Word didn't spread immediately, but something shifted after that conversation. Not externally, no sudden scrutiny, no whispered rumors, but internally. I had allowed myself to be seen by someone who knew the ecosystem I lived in. The stakes became real in a way they hadn't been before. This wasn't an abstract ethical exercise anymore. This was a life unfolding in proximity to others. Over the following weeks, the changes of physical, emotional, social, continued at a pace that felt deliberate rather than invasive. My body adapted as if responding to long-deferred instructions, not foreign ones. More striking than any visible shift was how my emotional range reorganized itself. Feelings I had once categorized as distractions became sources of information. I found myself pausing before decisions, not to suppress emotion, but to consult it. This made me slower. It also made me better. I noticed how often authority was confused with certainty, especially in academic spaces. How much confidence was performative. As my own internal narrative softened, I became less interested in defending positions and more interested in understanding impacts. This had consequences. Some colleagues responded with curiosity. Others with subtle withdrawal. I was no longer as legible to them, and legibility, I learned, is a kind of currency. At home, the reckoning grew more intimate. I began sorting through old belongings, not in a dramatic purge, but in quiet inventory. Clothes I'd worn out of habit rather than attachment. Objects that represented versions of myself I'd performed competently but without affection. I didn't hate those versions. I felt tenderness toward them. They had done their best with the information they had. One night, standing in my bedroom, I allowed myself to imagine a future self without immediately interrogating its plausibility. Not fantasy, just possibility. The exercise was unexpectedly difficult. I had built my life around optimization, not imagination. Letting myself want something without first justifying it felt radical. The first time I stepped outside presenting differently, not dramatically, not provocatively, just intentionally, I felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with clothing. Every interaction carried a question mark. Was that glance curiosity or judgment? Was that smile polite or strained? I became acutely aware of the social calculus women perform constantly, a vigilance I had previously theorized but never embodied. It was exhausting. It was also illuminating. I noticed how often I was interrupted. How frequently my expertise was subtly second-guessed. How compliments replaced acknowledgments. None of this was universal or constant, but it was consistent enough to register. I felt anger, then guilt for not having noticed sooner when others described the same experiences. Empathy, I learned, is not just understanding, it's accountability for what you once ignored. When I finally told my sister, it was over dinner at her kitchen table, the ordinary chaos of family life buffering the weight of the conversation. I spoke slowly. I answered questions honestly. I allowed silence to do some of the work. She cried, not because she thought she was losing me, but because she realized how little she had known about my inner life. I wish you'd trusted me sooner, she said. I wish I'd trusted myself sooner, I replied. Neither of us was wrong. As months passed, the narrative others projected onto me grew louder, but so did my ability to live without narrating myself defensively. I corrected misinformation when necessary. I set boundaries when curiosity crossed into entitlement. I learned that visibility is not owed, but it can be chosen strategically, ethically. The serum faded into the background of my life, no longer the centerpiece of the story. It had catalyzed change, yes, but the transformation was sustained by daily decisions, how I spoke, how I listened, how I allowed myself to be changed by others without surrendering my agency. One evening, reviewing my earliest notes, I was struck by how afraid I had been of destabilization. I had equated stability with stasis, integrity with consistency. What I was learning instead was that integrity could be dynamic, that remaining faithful to oneself sometimes required revision. The experiment had answered its original question. The observer could become the subject. The harder question, the one that still unfolded each day, was how to live responsibly once you understood yourself more clearly than before. There is a point in every transformation where progress stops feeling like progress and starts feeling like exposure. For me, it arrived quietly, disguised as routine. I had been presenting differently at work for several weeks by then, not dramatically, not in a way that demanded commentary, but clearly enough that silence around it had begun to feel intentional. Most people were polite. Some were warm. A few were conspicuously careful, as if interacting with me now required a revised manual they were afraid to consult incorrectly. I understood that instinct. I was revising my own manual daily. The first formal complication came not from hostility, but from concern. An administrator I'd known for years asked to meet. Her email was impeccably neutral, the kind that signals seriousness without accusation. We sat across from each other in a glass-walled conference room that offered privacy only as a courtesy. She spoke about institutional responsibility, about public perception, about ensuring that personal choices didn't compromise professional credibility. She never told me to stop. She never had to. Instead, she asked whether I felt stable, whether this period of change might affect my judgment, whether it was wise to continue self-experimentation while occupying a leadership role. These were reasonable questions on the surface. They were also questions I had never been asked when male colleagues went through divorces, breakdowns, ideological shifts, or reckless productivity streaks fueled by untreated stress. I answered carefully. I emphasized safeguards, transparency, oversight. I did not apologize for existing. When the meeting ended, she thanked me for my professionalism. I sat alone afterward, aware that I had just passed an invisible test I hadn't known I was taking, and that I would likely have to keep passing it indefinitely. That was when resentment crept in. Not rage. Not bitterness. Something quieter and more corrosive, the realization that my margin for error had shrunk. That mistakes I had once been allowed to make privately would now be read symbolically. That I was no longer just myself in the room, I was an example, whether I consented to that role or not. This awareness sharpened everything. I edited myself more. Not out of shame, but out of strategy. I chose my words with increased precision, my silences with intention. I became hyper-aware of how emotion registered on my face, how confidence was perceived when filtered through a body that no longer benefited from automatic authority. The irony was not lost on me. The more aligned I felt internally, the more effort it took to remain externally legible. Socially, the shifts were uneven. Some friendships deepened. People who had always valued emotional honesty leaned in, asked better questions, admitted things about themselves they hadn't voiced before. Others drifted, quietly and without explanation. Invitations slowed. Conversations stayed surface level. I learned not to chase clarity from people who had already chosen distance as their answer. The hardest moments were not confrontations, but misalignments of intention. A colleague praised my bravery in a tone that felt less like admiration and more like relief that he didn't have to examine his own complacency. A stranger asked invasive questions framed as curiosity but delivered without consent. An article circulated internally about my research that subtly reframed my work as autobiographical, as if my credibility now required personal justification. I considered pushing back publicly. I didn't. Not because I lacked conviction, but because I was still learning discernment. When to speak. When to conserve energy. When silence was self-erasure, and when it was self-preservation. At home, the emotional work intensified. My sister tried, earnestly, imperfectly. She corrected herself when she stumbled. She defended me in conversations I wasn't present for. But she also grieved, sometimes aloud, sometimes not, the version of me she thought she'd had. I let her. Grief doesn't imply rejection. It implies adjustment. One night, after her kids were asleep, she admitted something that startled us both. I keep worrying I'll say the wrong thing, she said. And then I worry that worrying makes it about me. That's not wrong, I told her. It just can't be where it ends. That became something of a mantra for both of us. Discomfort wasn't the problem. Stagnation was. Physically, the transformation reached a kind of plateau, not an end, but a settling. My body felt less like a site of negotiation and more like a collaborator. I stopped cataloging changes obsessively. I trusted sensation again. That trust felt radical. Emotionally, though, I was entering more dangerous territory. Because clarity, once achieved, removes plausible deniability. I could no longer claim ignorance about what misalignment felt like. I could no longer pretend neutrality when policies, jokes, or assumptions harmed people whose experiences I now shared more closely. The cost of integrity rose with awareness. There was a moment, small but decisive, when a junior researcher came to me privately. She spoke about harassment she hadn't reported. About fear. About exhaustion. She told me she came to me specifically because she thought I would listen differently now. I did listen. And afterward, alone in my office, I felt the full weight of what transformation demands when it becomes visible. This wasn't about self-acceptance anymore. It was about stewardship. About what access to power obligates you to do once you understand its asymmetries from the inside. I intervened. Carefully. Correctly. With documentation and allies and process. It worked. And it changed how I saw myself again, not as someone becoming, but as someone responsible. That night, I reread my earliest notes and barely recognized the person who had worried most about personal consequence. The transformation had not made me smaller, or safer, or simpler. It had made me answerable. And that, I was beginning to understand, was the point. There is a particular kind of fatigue that doesn't come from overwork or lack of sleep, but from being continually interpreted. I didn't recognize it at first. I mistook it for adjustment stress, for the natural friction of living through visible change. But as months passed, I realized something more subtle was happening. My life had become a text others felt entitled to read closely, annotate freely, and sometimes misquote entirely. Every interaction carried an echo. A question that sounded simple but wasn't. A compliment that contained an assumption. A silence that suggested deliberation rather than ease. Even kindness began to feel conditional, not false, but cautious, as if people were afraid of getting it wrong and chose distance over engagement. What surprised me most was how often this came from people who believed themselves to be progressive. They wanted me to represent clarity. Resolution. A narrative arc that made sense to them. When I didn't provide that, when I spoke honestly about uncertainty, about ambivalence, about the parts of transition that felt less like arrival and more like continual recalibration, I saw disappointment flicker across their faces. Ambiguity made them uncomfortable. I understood that impulse. I had spent my career reducing complexity to models that could be shared, tested, refined. But human lives resist that kind of closure. And my refusal to simplify myself for consumption was, in its own way, an ethical stance. Still, it was exhausting. There were days I longed to be unremarkable again. Not unseen, but unexamined. To move through spaces without carrying symbolic weight. To make mistakes without fearing they would be generalized, abstracted, used to justify someone else's skepticism. I began to pull back socially, not dramatically, not resentfully, but deliberately. I spent more time alone, not out of isolation, but to recalibrate my internal compass without constant external feedback. I returned to habits I'd neglected, long walks without headphones, cooking meals slowly, reading books that had nothing to do with identity or science or justification. In those quiet spaces, I encountered a difficult truth. Part of me had enjoyed the sense of purpose that came with transformation. The feeling of meaning. And while that meaning had been genuine, it carried a risk, the temptation to turn growth into a performance, integrity into identity. I didn't want that. So I asked myself harder questions. Not who am I becoming? But what am I willing to be accountable for? Not does this feel authentic? But does this choice reduce harm, including harm to myself? Those questions didn't yield immediate answers. They yielded constraints. And within those constraints, something steadier began to form. At work, I stopped volunteering my story as context unless it was truly relevant. I redirected conversations back to systems, outcomes, shared responsibility. When people tried to center me as evidence of success, of progress, of possibility, I resisted gently but firmly. My experience was data, yes, but it was not proof of anything universal. This frustrated some people. It relieved others. One afternoon, a graduate student asked me during office hours whether I regretted the experiment. The question wasn't prying. It was earnest, even anxious, as if my answer might preempt their own future decisions. I paused longer than usual before responding. No, I said finally. But regret isn't the right metric. I think responsibility is. They frowned, so I continued. The experiment gave me access to myself. What I do with that access, how I treat people, how I wield authority, how I remain open to revision, that's what determines whether it was ethical. Not just that it worked. They nodded slowly. I hope they heard what I meant, that transformation is not validation. It's invitation. At home, the emotional terrain shifted again. My sister stopped asking how I was doing and started asking what I needed. It was a small linguistic change, but it carried respect. She no longer framed my life as a process to be monitored, but as a reality to be shared. One evening, she admitted she had corrected a coworker who spoke dismissively about gender expression. Not angrily. Not defensively. Just factually. I realized I didn't need to understand everything, she said. I just needed to stop letting ignorance pass as opinion. I felt something like pride, not in myself, but in the ripple effect of honesty handled well. Not all ripples were gentle. There were losses I hadn't anticipated. A friend who stopped returning messages without explanation. A collaborator who quietly removed me from a project, citing fit. A distant relative who sent a long email framed as concern but rooted in fear, asking whether I was sure this was healthy. I answered some of these. I let others go unanswered. Closure, I learned, is not always mutual. Sometimes it's unilateral. The hardest reckoning came not from others, but from memory. I began to see my past differently, not with shame, but with accountability. Moments where I had laughed at jokes I now recognized as dismissive. Times I had chosen neutrality because it was convenient. Opportunities to intervene that I had declined because they didn't implicate me personally. This wasn't self-flagellation. It was inventory. I couldn't change those moments. But I could let them inform my present. I could refuse to use my transformation as absolution. Growth did not erase prior responsibility, it clarified future obligation. Late one night, reviewing my earliest lab footage, I watched myself inject the serum with a steadiness that now looked almost naive. I remembered how I had framed the experiment as controlled, bounded, reversible. It had been none of those things. And yet, I didn't regret that either. Because control, I understood now, is not the same as care. And care, when practiced seriously, accepts uncertainty as part of its ethical landscape. The transformation had not given me answers. It had given me better questions. And it had given me the courage to live without pretending those questions would ever fully resolve. That, more than any measurable outcome, felt like progress. I used to think transformation was something you could complete. That belief lingered longer than I cared to admit, even as evidence contradicted it daily. I had absorbed the cultural instinct to look for before and after markers, to treat change as a passage rather than a practice. It's comforting, that idea, that you can cross a threshold and be done with becoming. But nothing about this experience allowed that illusion to survive. By the time the serum had long since ceased to be an active variable, its consequences were woven so thoroughly into my life that separating cause from choice became impossible. And that, I realized, was the most honest outcome. The experiment had not made me someone else. It had removed enough internal resistance for me to stop outsourcing my identity to habit and expectation. What followed was not certainty. What followed was responsibility. I noticed how often people wanted reassurance from me, not just about gender, but about meaning. They wanted to know whether change was worth the cost, whether self-knowledge delivered peace, whether integrity was sustainable in systems that quietly punish deviation. I understood the impulse. I had wanted those assurances myself. But I could no longer offer them cleanly. Instead, I learned to answer differently. I talked about trade-offs. About learning when to be visible and when to be private without confusing either for cowardice. About the difference between being understood and being respected, and how sometimes you only get one. I talked about grief that doesn't imply regret, about joy that coexists with vigilance, about the discipline required to remain open without dissolving into performance. Some people were disappointed. Others stayed. That distinction became a quiet guide for how I spent my time. Professionally, I began shifting my focus, not away from research, but toward mentorship and institutional design. I had less interest now in proving what was possible and more interest in shaping conditions under which others could explore without disproportionate risk. Policies, review structures, reporting mechanisms, these things had once felt peripheral to a real science. Now I understood them as moral architecture. I was invited to speak occasionally, though I declined more often than I accepted. When I did agree, I was explicit about boundaries. I refused framing that positioned me as an endpoint or exemplar. I spoke instead about process, about humility, about the danger of mistaking visibility for virtue. After one talk, a young man approached me quietly and said, "I thought I needed to know who I was before I acted. But maybe it's the other way around." I told him that action without reflection can be reckless, but reflection without action can be its own form of fear. He smiled, uncertain but relieved. I recognized that expression. At home, life settled into something gentler. Not easier, just less performative. My sister no longer watched me for signs of distress. I no longer watched her for signs of disappointment. We argued sometimes, about ordinary things. That felt like progress. My relationship with her children evolved, too. They accepted change without analysis, asked direct questions without agenda, adjusted faster than any adult I knew. One evening, one of them said, matter-of-factly, "You seem more like yourself now." I asked what they meant. "You listen better," they said, and went back to their game. I carried that with me for a long time. Alone, I continued the practice that had become central to my life, inventory without condemnation. I checked my motives. I noticed when defensiveness crept in disguised as principle. I paid attention to when fatigue made me less generous than I wanted to be. Some days, I failed. Those failures mattered, not because they negated growth, but because they reminded me that integrity is maintained, not achieved. The most surprising shift was how little I thought about the transformation itself anymore. It no longer occupied the center of my identity. It had become context, important, formative, but not exhaustive. I was not defined by the experiment, or by transition, or by visibility. I was defined by how I responded to complexity when it arose. And it always arose. Sometimes in the form of misunderstanding. Sometimes resentment. Sometimes quiet gratitude from someone who saw their own questions reflected without being answered for them. I learned to let all of it exist without needing to resolve it into narrative. One night, years after that first injection, I reread the earliest line I'd written in my private notes: "What happens when the observer becomes the subject?" At the time, I'd thought it was a scientific question. Now I understood it as a moral one. What happens is that distance disappears. Neutrality becomes choice. And empathy, real empathy, not conceptual, demands consequence. You begin to see yourself not as a static entity to be defended, but as a participant in shared systems, responsible for how your presence shapes them. You become accountable, not just for who you are, but for how honestly you live that truth in relation to others. That accountability did not make my life smaller. It made it meaningful. If there is anything educational in this experience, anything worth carrying forward, it is not the specifics of the transformation, nor the science that enabled it. It is this. Self-understanding is not an escape from responsibility. It is an entry point into it. And when pursued with care, humility, and patience, it does not isolate you from the world. It teaches you how to belong to it more honestly than before.